Chapter 1. It was one of those peculiar afternoons in early November when the London fog clings to your coat like a damp memory. The fire in our Baker Street rooms had burned down to a low smoulder, and Holmes, cross-legged in his chair, stared out the window at nothing in particular, his fingertips pressed together in that cathedral-like gesture of his, as though communing with some higher logic. I had just returned from my rounds and was midway through the second column of the Times when the silence was broken. "You see it too, don't you, Watson?" Holmes murmured without turning his head. I lowered the paper. "See what?" "The absurdity of it. A woman who appears in photographs taken a decade apart, looking precisely the same. Not older, not altered in the slightest, and in each one she is dead within 48 hours of its capture. Fascinating." My heart gave a small, involuntary leap, the kind I had come to associate with the birth of one of Holmes's more bizarre cases. "I'm afraid you've lost me entirely." Holmes tapped the corner of a worn manila envelope resting on the side table beside his violin. "The material arrived while you were gone. Delivered by courier. No note. No return address. Inside, 5 photographs, different eras, different locations, all bearing the same woman, and all connected to unsolved deaths." I crossed the room and opened the envelope. As Holmes had said, 5 photographs, sepia-toned black and white, even one with a faint hint of colour, each depicting a distinct scene. A family picnic, a theatre group, a street market, a countryside estate, and a wedding party. Yet there she was, always slightly off-centre, always dressed appropriately for the era and setting, and always wearing the same vacant, haunting expression. It was not merely resemblance, it was unmistakably the same woman. "Good Lord," I breathed. "What does it mean?" Holmes's eyes glittered. "That is precisely what I intend to find out." Before I could speak further, there was a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared a moment later, her expression caught between concern and curiosity. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's urgent. Brought this with her." She handed Holmes a 6th photograph. Holmes took one glance, and for the first time that day, his composure faltered. "It's her again," he whispered. The photo showed a man and woman outside a clockmaker's shop. The man's face was obscured, but the woman, our woman, stood beside him, holding a closed parasol, eyes boring into the lens with chilling directness. A date scribbled in the margin. November 3rd, 1891, today. Holmes stood in one fluid motion. "Send her in, Mrs. Hudson." And thus began the most disturbing and unexplainable mystery I had ever witnessed. A case that would test even Holmes's iron logic and threaten to unravel our understanding of time, death, and reality itself. Chapter 2. The woman who entered our sitting room that fog-draped afternoon was not what I had expected, not a frantic widow, nor a trembling housemaid from the East End. She carried herself with the measured poise of a governess, or perhaps an educated lady forced by circumstance to tread in strange waters. Her features were angular, but handsome in a way that made you look twice, and her dark green dress, though modest, was fashioned from expensive wool. Her gloves were neatly folded, in one hand. In the other she clutched a small leather case. Holmes, as ever, leapt from initial observation to psychological dissection without breaking rhythm. "Miss Lyle," he said, gesturing toward the chair opposite the fireplace. You've come from Paddington Station, but I suspect you boarded at Bath. Your train was late. Judging by your boots and the speckling of grey dust on your hem, you passed through an older quarter of the city before arriving here, possibly Wapping or Whitechapel. I dare say you've not come merely to deliver photographs. Jane's eyes widened a fraction, enough to betray astonishment before she caught herself. She sat, smoothing her skirt. You're correct on all accounts, though how you know these things I dare not guess. Holmes waved off the compliment with a flick of his long fingers. I'm more interested in what brought you to our door today. Name is Clara Lyle. I work as a private archivist, cataloguing family histories, estate documents, personal records. My clients are usually old money, families concerned with inheritance law, genealogical continuity, that sort of thing. And one of your clients possesses these photographs? I asked. Not quite. I came across them accidentally while digitizing old photographic plates for Lord Bellamy of Dorset. I was combing through negatives from the 1860s when I saw the first image. She opened the leather case and slid out a magnified copy of the photo Holmes had examined earlier, and then more as the project expanded. What unsettled me was how the same woman appeared across multiple family archives. Sometimes she was listed as a cousin, sometimes unnamed entirely. In one instance, she was supposedly a governess who died in a carriage accident, but in another taken 15 years later, she appears again. Same face, same expression. Holmes took the image between his fingers, turning it toward the light. You're certain these are not daughters or descendants? Family resemblances can be uncanny. Clara shook her head. Not when the exact same woman appears in photographs taken a generation apart. She hasn't aged, not a day, and every family I've traced has suffered an unexplained death within days of the photo being taken. Holmes's brow furrowed. He retrieved the earlier envelope and laid out the 5 images in a row on the table. I leaned in beside him, and suddenly the mood in the room shifted. The fire crackled. The distant clop of hooves echoed from Baker Street, but all else faded into the eerie stillness that came whenever Holmes focused entirely on a mystery. His gaze locked onto the photographs like a predator watching the subtle tremble of a leaf that might conceal prey. Who developed these photographs? He asked. Clara hesitated. Each was created by a different studio. Some no longer exist. But there is one commonality. In the lower right corner of each, if you enlarge the frame, you'll find the initials AV burned faintly into the silver nitrate backing. Holmes's expression shifted at once. Aurelius Vance, you know the name? She asked. I know the legend. A photographic pioneer from the 1850s who vanished under mysterious circumstances. Said to dabble in spirit photography and other metaphysical curiosities. But that was over 30 years ago. Clara nodded. There's more. I traced one of the originals to an estate auction in Reading. It was sold posthumously after the owner was found. She paused, searching for the word. Frozen. Not from cold, but from terror. His face contorted, as if he'd glimpsed death itself before it struck. Him. Holmes stood, his posture sharpened. Miss Lyle, I believe your case is one of the most fascinating to pass through this door in many months. If what you say is true, we are not merely confronting a string of coincidences or even forgeries. We are staring down a phenomenon that exists on the very fringe of science and madness. I felt a chill creep up the back of my neck. What are you suggesting, Holmes? That she is what? A ghost? A curse? Some spectral omen appearing in images like the angel of death? He turned to me slowly. I suggest nothing yet, Watson, but something unnatural lurks here. And if there's one thing I know, it is that even the unnatural has rules, and rules once discovered can be understood. Holmes returned to the fireplace and stirred the embers. Miss Lyle, do you have the names of the deceased, the families who possess these images? I do, she said, handing him a second document. There are 12 that I know of. I marked addresses and dates of death where available. Holmes studied it briefly. Watson, fetch your coat. We pay a visit tonight. Tonight? I blinked. The earliest of these deaths occurred in 1862. But the most recent was, he checked the paper again, 3 days ago. A Colonel Jasper Howlett died in his study after showing guests a curious old photograph of a woman he claimed haunted his family. The guests thought it was a joke, until they found him collapsed on the floor, eyes wide, mouth frozen mid-scream. Sayur swallowed. Clara, Holmes said, I must ask that you remain in London until I send for you again, and under no circumstances should you share these photographs with anyone else. She nodded gravely. You believe I'm in danger? I believe, Holmes said quietly, that those who see the woman and know she is not meant to be there begin to draw her attention. And if that's true, Miss Lyle, then yes, you are very much in danger. And with that, we set off into the fog-choked streets of London, chasing a woman who defied time, death, and the boundaries of rational thought. 1 photograph at a time. Chapter 3. The night had wrapped London in its clammy shroud, the kind of damp cold that crept up your sleeves and into your lungs. Fog coiled along the gaslit streets, licking at cobblestones like some slow, lurking creature. Holmes and I travelled by hansom cab through winding alleys, bound for Kensington, where the late Colonel Jasper Howlett had lived, and more curiously, died. Holmes had spoken little on the way, his features drawn tight in that expression I had come to associate with both anticipation and calculation. He sat with his arms crossed, fingers drumming against his forearm, eyes narrowed as if mentally reconstructing the fatal moment that had reduced Colonel Howlett from hearty retiree to lifeless corpse. "What do you make of Miss Lyle?" I asked, as the carriage jolted over a rut. Holmes didn't turn. She is frightened, but not for herself. Curious, but not reckless. She believes in the rational world, but suspects, perhaps for the first time in her life, that something has trespassed into it. And you, I believe, Holmes said, that this woman, this recurring phantom in the photographs, is no mere figment. Someone, whether for mischief, revenge, or something far more esoteric, is orchestrating a pattern. That pattern has gone unnoticed until now. But patterns, he added, finally looking at me, are my province. We arrived at the late Colonel's residence, a solemn brick townhouse shrouded in ivy. A heavy brass knocker, tarnished with age, hung in the shape of a lion's head. The door was answered by a housekeeper in mourning black, her eyes red-rimmed from tears, but sharp with suspicion. I'm terribly sorry to intrude at this hour." Holmes began smoothly, flashing the familiar card that bore his name and profession. "We've been asked by a colleague to follow up on Colonel Howlett's untimely passing. You were in the house when it occurred?" "I was, sir," she said, her voice tight with suppressed grief. "It was ghastly. He'd just shown a photograph to Mr. Wexley and Miss Carmichael, friends of his from the old regiment. He laughed about it, said it was cursed. Then he just fell back, like he'd seen something no one else could." "Could we see the room in which it happened?" I asked gently. She hesitated, then nodded, leading us through narrow halls, hung with military medals and hunting rifles. We arrived at the study, a dark wooded room filled with pipe smoke and the scent of leather and old books. A green-shaded lamp burned low over the colonel's writing desk. The photograph sat beneath a glass dome at the centre of the room. Holmes approached it slowly, as one might approach an altar in a strange church. He lifted the dome with gloved fingers and studied the image within. I stood beside him, squinting. It showed a formal dinner party, perhaps 20 people arranged in careful tiers like a choir, and yet, even amid all the finery and cheerful faces, she stood out, the woman. She was near the back, in shadow, her hands clasped before her, expression blank but utterly compelling. She wore a dress from a different decade than the rest. Her eyes, I could not describe them except to say they made the hairs on my neck stand straight. Holmes turned the photograph over. No inscription. Typical. He pulled a magnifying glass from his coat and peered at the image closely. Then he froze. "There, it is," he murmured. "Bottom right corner. A.V., the same mysterious photographer." He replaced the dome and walked the perimeter of the room, running his hand lightly over the bookshelf spines and picture frames. I followed, watching him bend to examine the rug's edge, the scuffed floorboards near the fireplace, even a decanter that had been half emptied. "Colonel Howlett was not afraid until he held this photograph," Holmes said, thinking aloud. "He mocked it, yet within minutes he was dead. Heart failure, the report said. But a man in good health doesn't simply drop." "A fright-induced seizure?" I offered. "Perhaps. But induced by what?" He paused, then turned abruptly. "Watson, there's a connection forming between the woman, the photographs, and the circumstances of each death. She is not simply a face, she is a trigger." "Trigger for what?" "That is what we must discover." We took our leave after copying the photograph's details. Holmes, in his usual fashion, asked for a second look at the photograph, and then, unexpectedly, borrowed the Colonel's walking cane from the umbrella stand, thanking the housekeeper with a cryptic nod. She watched us go with a mixture of sorrow and confusion. Back in the cab, Holmes examined the cane under the dim light from a nearby gas lamp. "Holmes," I said cautiously, "we're pursuing a woman who appears across decades, never aging, in photographs tied to unexplained deaths. Are you not the least bit tempted to consider something paranormal?" He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Tempted, yes. Convinced, no. There is always a man behind the mask, Watson, even if he is a magician. What seems like sorcery is often simply precision." He rapped the cane twice against the carriage wall. "And now, to our next stop, the Photographic Society on Fleet." Street. If Aurelius Vance ever existed beyond myth, they will know where he vanished. But it's well past visiting hours, I said. Holmes gave a smile that held no warmth. All the better. We may find what others were never meant to see. Nund, so we plunged deeper into the mystery. A case that no longer simply danced at the edges of reason, but threatened to tear through its very fabric. Chapter 4 Fleet Street was nearly deserted by the time our cab pulled up outside the Photographic Society of London. The great gaslights along the boulevard burned with a pale orange glow, casting elongated shadows across the Gothic facades of the buildings. Most shops had long shuttered for the evening, but the Society's headquarters, a modest 3-story structure flanked by 2 publishing houses, still bore a faint glimmer of life through its 2nd-story windows. Holmes stepped out before the carriage had fully halted. Come, Watson. If we're lucky, the caretaker is asleep. If we're less fortunate, he's the kind of man who values a bribe more than his duties. Either way, we'll find our way in. And if we're caught, gave me a sly smile, then I'll tell them we're researching the haunting properties of bromide on the human psyche. To my astonishment and mild irritation, the front door was unlocked. Holmes pushed it open with a quiet creak, and we slipped into a narrow vestibule lined with framed portraits of bearded men in high collars and stiff expressions, each one identified as a founding fellow. A lingering scent of chemicals and old wood hung in the air. We ascended a staircase, carpeted in red velvet, our footsteps muffled. On the 2nd floor, we found a reading room cluttered with wooden cabinets, leather-bound ledgers, photographic plates, and folders labelled by year. Holmes's eyes danced as he surveyed the room. Start with the V's, he instructed. Look for any mention of Aurelius Vance or his affiliates. I began sifting through the alphabetical index, while Holmes moved to the archival shelf marked Obsolete Processes. After several minutes of silence, I came across a name that made my breath catch. Holmes, I said, holding up a registry page. Aurelius Vance, listed as a guest exhibitor in 1858. His submitted work was described as speculative exposures into temporal layering. Holmes joined me and read over my shoulder. Withdrawn before exhibition. Artist disqualified following controversy. Curious. What controversy? We searched further until Holmes found a locked drawer labelled Suppressed Submissions. With a glance at me, he pulled a narrow tool from his pocket and worked the lock open with a deft flick. The drawer creaked as it slid free, revealing an envelope, brittle with age, marked only with the initials AV inside, were 5 photographic plates, unlike any I had ever seen. The first showed an alleyway in Whitechapel, mist coiling around gas lamps. In the foreground, partially obscured by smoke, stood the woman. In the second image, she appeared outside a hospital ward. In the third, amidst a grave-digging crew. Each one bore a chilling sense of stillness, as if time had frozen around her. She was never centred, always an edge figure, just part of the scene, but always unmistakable. The plates are decades old, Holmes murmured, yet she hasn't changed a whit. It's no trick of exposure. There's a deliberateness to her inclusion, like a signature hidden in the frame. Then Holmes noticed something we hadn't seen. Etched faintly into the border of the final plate was a sentence, barely visible even under the magnifying glass. She remembers the moment you see her, A prickling sensation crawled up my spine. Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then he tucked the plate into his coat, replaced the rest, and relocked the drawer. As we exited the building and stepped back into the damp night, I dared to ask, "What does it mean, Holmes?" He lit a cigarette before answering, his face obscured in shadow and smoke. "There's more here than forgery or obsession. That inscription, 'She remembers the moment you see her,' suggests intent. Not merely recurrence. It implies the woman is aware. Aware? Holmes, are you suggesting these photographs are sentient?" "No," he said flatly. "I'm suggesting someone is using photography as a medium to channel something beyond it. And whoever that someone is, whether Vance or another, they discovered a way to bend perception across time. Not just to capture an image, but to implant a presence." We walked in silence for a while. London, at that hour, had begun to die down to its skeletal hum. The streets emptied. The fog thickened. Holmes suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" I listened. At first I heard only the distant whistle of a train. Then footsteps, delicate, hesitant. From behind us we turned. The street behind was empty. No figure emerged from the mist. No shadow betrayed movement. Yet the feeling persisted. Someone had been there. Holmes moved with sudden energy, stepping into the middle of the road, scanning the alleys, the rooftops, every doorway. He cursed under his breath and motioned for us to move quickly. "Come, we're being watched, and not just by the living." Back at Baker Street, Holmes locked the door behind us and extinguished all but one lamp. He drew the curtain tightly, then pulled the photograph from Howlett's study out from his coat and compared it to the plate he'd taken from the Society archives. "She's in both. Different dress, same face, same posture." He lined up all the photographs and began to circle points of alignment. The direction of her gaze, the angle of her hands, the position of her shoulders. What emerged was a startling realization. They weren't random. They followed a pattern, a progressive sequence, as though each image captured a piece of a larger movement, like frames in a film. "She's turning," Holmes said under his breath, "from profile to three-quarter to frontal." "Toward what?" Holmes looked at me, his expression dark. "Toward us." And for the first time in all our years together, I saw something in Holmes I had never witnessed before. Not awe, not arrogance, fear. Chapter 5. The fire burned low in the hearth of our Baker Street rooms as Holmes stood before the laid-out photographs, arms crossed, eyes narrowed in calculation. The effect of the woman's shifting pose, subtle at first, now seemed more deliberate, as if she were turning toward us with each new image, like the slow unfolding of a dreadful truth. Holmes pointed to the most recent photo, Colonel Howlett's dinner party. In this image she faces almost directly toward the camera. But in the earliest she is barely visible, turned nearly in profile. I frowned. "You think she's moving across time? Like she's aware of being seen?" "Not moving," Holmes said, "but staged. Or better yet, revealed. Each photograph is not simply an image, Watson. It's a window, and someone or something is on the other side, slowly pushing through." I felt cold despite the fire. "You're not seriously suggesting we're being watched through the photographs?" I'm suggesting, he said, that the woman is a construct, a figure embedded with surgical precision across generations, and the purpose of that insertion, to be remembered, to persist, possibly even to manifest. We both turned as a sharp rapping came at the door. It was past midnight. Holmes answered quickly. Clara Lyle stood in the hallway, soaked from the fog and trembling. I'm sorry to intrude, she stammered, her voice on the edge of panic. But something's happened. I didn't know where else to go. Holmes ushered her inside and took her coat while I offered her a chair. Her gloves were damp, her eyes ringed with sleeplessness. I received another photograph, she said, delivered to my hotel. No envelope, just slid under the door sometime after midnight. Holmes took the image from her shaking hand and studied it silently. I looked over his shoulder and immediately felt a sick twist in my stomach. It was a picture of Holmes standing in front of the Society building, from perhaps an hour earlier, and just behind him, partially obscured by a lamp-post, her, the woman, dressed in mourning black, eyes fixed directly on the camera. Holmes's jaw tightened. So she has begun appearing in real-time images. Clara covered her mouth. I don't understand. How could she be there? I didn't take the photograph. No one was around. No one visible. Holmes corrected. But someone was watching. And now we must ask, who is behind the lens? For the first time since I had met him, Holmes looked unsure. He placed the photograph down carefully, as if it might shatter, then paced the room. We must speak with someone who knew Aurelius Vance, he said. Someone who can tell us why this all began. He stopped abruptly. Watson, do you recall the name Emery Graft? I nodded. The occult historian. You once debunked his theory about ley lines and ritual sites in Essex. Yes, and he never forgave me, Holmes muttered. Nevertheless, if anyone has records on Vance's later experiments, it will be him. Clara looked between us. Are you sure we can trust him? Holmes's lips curved into a humorless smile. Trust is irrelevant. All that matters is what he knows. By morning, we stood before a crumbling townhouse in Lambeth, the home of Emery Graft. Ivy strangled its railings. The brass knocker was tarnished, and the windows wore a permanent film of soot. It was the kind of place that had not seen sunlight in decades. The door opened before we knocked. Emery Graft was tall and cadaverous, his face deeply lined, his eyes sunken yet burning with a feverish intelligence. He wore a robe embroidered with arcane symbols and a chain of keys around his neck. Holmes, he said flatly, you're the last man I expected to see. Come to laugh again at my ghost theories? Not today, Emery, Holmes replied. Today, I come to ask what you know about Aurelius Vance. The man's expression shifted at once. He stepped back. You've seen it, haven't you? Holmes raised a brow. Seen what? The woman. There was silence. Graft turned and beckoned us inside. The interior was worse than the exterior. Books stacked to the ceiling, jars of indeterminate liquid on every shelf. The smell of mildew and dry parchment thick in the air. He led us to a back room filled with old photographic equipment and lit a dim oil lamp. I warned them, Graft said, pacing. In 1857, Vance began experimenting with long-exposure portraiture. He believed photography could capture more than Light, that it could steal echoes from beyond the veil. Beyond the veil of what? Clara asked. Time, death, memory. He said the soul, if real, must be visible on some frequency, that a camera could catch it when the eye could not. Holmes folded his arms. And did he succeed? Graft gave a haunted smile. He succeeded in seeing something, but it didn't come from the subject. It came from the space behind the subject. Something noticed the camera, and it wanted to be remembered. He pulled a folder from a drawer. Inside were sketches, diagrams, and a letter penned by Vance in shaky hand. She appeared first as a shadow, then a figure, then a woman with no name but endless patience. I stopped the experiments, but she remained, in the plates, in the darkroom, in the gaps of time. Holmes read silently. Then he said, "So she is not a ghost. She's an imprint, a mnemonic parasite." "Yes," Graft whispered. "She lives in the act of observation. The more who see her, the more she exists, and if she is seen in the present, she can cross over," Holmes finished. "Not merely into a photograph, but into the real world," Clara gasped. "That's why the deaths follow the photographs." Graft nodded. "Each death is like a door opening wider." Holmes took a breath. "Is there a way to close it?" "There was one attempt," Graft said. "Vance buried his final photographic plates in an unmarked crypt in Kensal Green Cemetery. He believed sealing them with mercury and silver nitrate would trap her." "Did it work?" I asked. Graft looked at us with a hollow expression. "Appears in photographs taken last week, doesn't she?" None of us answered. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, prepare your revolver. Tonight we will go to the cemetery." Chapter 6. Kensal Green. Cemetery by daylight is solemn, beautiful even, an open-air museum of mausoleums and sorrow. But by night it becomes a different place altogether. The trees seemed to close in, the wind carried whispers, and the moonlight struggled through thick clouds, as though reluctant to illuminate the dead. Holmes, Clara, and I stood just beyond the rusted gates shortly after midnight, lanterns in hand, our breath visible in the crisp November air. A fine mist clung to the marble angels and Celtic crosses, veiling the tombstones in ghostly haze. Clara kept close to my side, silent but visibly shaken. Holmes, on the other hand, was taut with focus, moving like a bloodhound who had caught the scent. "I've consulted old surveyor maps," Holmes whispered, unfolding a thin piece of parchment. The Vance crypt was never officially registered, deliberately, I suspect. But Graft's notes point to a tomb belonging to one Gregory Quill, a pseudonym Vance used when renting a studio in Clerkenwell. If he buried anything here, it will be under that name. We advanced slowly down the overgrown path, lantern light glinting off wet marble and iron fences. The names of the long dead rose around us in grim silence. There was no sound but the crunch of our boots on gravel and the distant call of a night bird. After nearly 30 minutes of searching, Holmes stopped. "There," he said, pointing to a small family vault set between two crumbling obelisks. Its stone door bore no visible family crest. Only a name etched in fading letters. G. Quill, 1821-1872, remembered beyond time. Clara shuddered. That phrase, it's in the Vance letter. Holmes stepped forward and examined the seal on the crypt. It had been tampered with recently. The iron handle bore fresh scratches, and the faintest trace of silver dust clung to the hinges. "She's been disturbed," Holmes muttered, "or perhaps she never fully slept." I reached for my revolver instinctively. Holmes produced a small crowbar from beneath his coat and wedged it into the crack of the stone door. With a long groan, the slab shifted inward, revealing narrow steps that descended into darkness. The stench that rose to greet us was not of decay, but something far older. Cold dust, mildew, and the sharp bite of chemicals. Holmes lit a second lantern and handed it to Clara. Then, without a word, he descended into the earth. We followed. The crypt opened into a square chamber lined with stone niches. In its centre sat an iron strongbox on a raised dais. Around it, remnants of shattered glass and a broken camera lens lay scattered like ancient offerings. Holmes approached the box. "This is it." Clara hovered at the threshold. "What if opening it lets her out?" Holmes didn't look up. "She's already out. The question is whether the original plate still exists. If it does, we may have one chance to sever her." Unlatched the box. Inside were 6 photographic plates, wrapped in silk and sealed in silver nitrate sleeves. Each bore a label, dated from 1857 to 1859. In the final plate, Holmes held it up to the lantern's light. We saw the clearest image. Yet she stood alone in an empty room, not part of a crowd or party, but centered, posed, arms folded, eyes staring directly at the lens. Her face bore no malice, yet no warmth. It was not a portrait. It was a capture. Holmes inhaled sharply. This is the first." He laid it gently on the lid of the strongbox and reached into his coat, withdrawing a small flask. "Mercury nitrate and phosphorus," he explained. "A solution destructive to glass emulsion, but not to metal. If we dissolve this plate, we may sever her tether." Before he could pour the liquid, Clara gasped, "She's here!" We turned. At the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the moonlight, stood the unmistakable figure of the woman. But she was not a phantom. She cast a shadow. Her feet touched the ground. Holmes froze. "Watson," he said quietly, "if she moves, shoot her." I raised my revolver. "But Holmes, what if she's just a woman?" He didn't answer. Clara clutched my sleeve. Then the figure began to descend. Her steps made no sound, but each one struck like thunder. Her eyes never left the plate on the box. Her expression unchanged, unblinking. Holmes quickly uncorked the flask and raised it. The woman paused, just one step from the floor. For a moment, I thought she might speak, but instead, her face began to change, not physically, but photographically. Her features flickered. In 1 second, she looked like the woman in the 1860 image. Then, the 1883 wedding photo. Then the one outside the clockmaker's. As if we were seeing all her versions at once. A kaleidoscope of identity tumbling in silence. "She's becoming unstuck," Holmes muttered. "Too many images, too many eyes." He poured the solution over the plate. It hissed as it spread. The woman opened her mouth. but no sound came. Her eyes locked with mine, and for a split second I felt a pull, a terrifying intimacy, as if she had chosen me as the next image. And then she vanished. No scream, no flash, just gone. Only the smell of burning chemicals and the sound of my own heartbeat remained. Holmes collapsed onto the floor beside the empty strongbox. "She's unanchored," he whispered. "We didn't destroy her. We severed her from her origin." Clara sank to her knees. "Then where is she now?" Holmes looked up slowly. Everywhere. Chapter 7. In the days following our midnight descent into the crypt, a strange hush settled over Baker Street. Holmes had returned in a condition I can only describe as worn at the edges. It was not the exhaustion of a man after a chase, nor the melancholy that sometimes overtook him between cases. It was something deeper, a haunted quality, as if the act of unmooring the woman from her photographic prison had not solved the mystery, but only darkened its depth. He refused all visitors, left his violin untouched, ate only when I placed food before him, and spoke little beyond the occasional murmured deduction, spoken half to himself. Clara Lyle had returned to her lodgings under Holmes's strict instructions. No mirrors, no photographs, and no light after sundown. Though she obeyed without question, I could tell the encounter had shaken her to her very core. She wrote to me once, a short note on parchment with slightly trembling lines. "She's not gone. I dreamt her again. Only now she knows my name." Holmes read the letter, said nothing, and burned it in the fireplace. By the third day, the mood in our flat had grown unbearable. I confronted Holmes just before dawn, having risen early in the hope that some clear-headed discussion might break the fog that had enveloped him. "You must tell me what's troubling you," I said firmly. "This case, this thing, has changed you. You believe the plate was destroyed, and yet you act as if she lingers." Holmes sat by the window, eyes trained on the street below, unmoving. "Because I no longer believe she was confined to the plate." "What do you mean?" "I believe she outgrew it, Watson. That it served merely as her cradle, an incubation. The moment enough minds recognized her, she began to exist not in the image, but in us. Memory is a powerful vessel, perception even more so." I stared at him horrified. "You're saying we released her into thought itself?" He looked up at me, and I saw something I had never expected to find in Holmes's eyes. Dread. Stories are viruses, Watson, and some are more contagious than others. That very evening Inspector Lestrade arrived unannounced. He looked pale, his eyes bloodshot, and rimmed with the weariness of a man deprived of sleep. "Holmes," he said without greeting, "I need you to come with me." Holmes rose at once. "What's happened?" Lestrade swallowed. A man was found dead in a photographer's studio in Shoreditch, locked from the inside. No wounds, nothing stolen, only... He hesitated. There was a photograph beside him, a new one, still damp from development. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "She's active again," Holmes said softly. Lestrade furrowed his brow. "Who?" Holmes didn't answer. The studio was located on a side street behind the old market district. a narrow brick building wedged between a dressmaker's shop and a newsagent's. Its window was fogged over from the inside, and the sign above the Door Peterman and Sons, fine portraiture, hung crooked on rusted chains. Inside, the gaslights flickered dimly. The air was heavy with fixer chemicals, and the faint metallic scent of something far less sterile. The body lay in the developing room, slumped against a work table. A man in his 40s, dressed in a brown vest and high boots, eyes wide in death, but otherwise untouched. No signs of trauma, no forced entry. Holmes crouched beside the body, lifting the man's hand gently. Still curled, rigor mortis hasn't fully set in. He died within the last 4 hours. He turned to the table, and there it was, a single photograph, still glossy with chemical sheen. It showed the room in which we stood, taken from the far corner, the body already in place and standing over him, the woman. But this time, her face was smiling. I felt my stomach twist. "This cannot be," I muttered. "The photograph shows what hasn't happened, or what did happen, but we weren't here to witness it." Holmes held the photograph up to the gaslight, his hands steady. "She's no longer passively embedded. She's directing the tableau, choosing the scenes." "Like a play?" Lestrade asked. "No," Holmes said. "Like a warning." We searched the studio. Holmes discovered a journal, half filled with notes scrawled in erratic ink. It belonged to the deceased Thomas Peterman. She came to me in a dream, asked me to take her picture, said she would be beautiful, eternal. I don't remember shooting the image, only waking with the glass plate already drying. She says, "I will be remembered. I don't want to be." Holmes closed the journal and looked at me. He didn't photograph her. She used him to develop herself. "She's becoming stronger," I whispered. Holmes nodded. "And smarter." We returned to Baker Street in silence. The fog outside had thickened into a pale wall. Inside, the fire had gone out, and our rooms felt unusually cold. Holmes sat heavily in his armchair and stared at the embers. "We made a mistake, Watson. We treated her as a ghost. But ghosts don't evolve. She learns, adapts, and now she's testing how far she can reach." "She's appearing in new photographs," I said, "not just old ones." "Yes, which means she's no longer confined to the past." He leaned forward. "She's in our time now, watching, staging, imprinting." I sank into my chair. "Then what do we do?" Holmes turned toward me slowly. We stopped looking at her. I blinked. "What?" He stood and began gathering every photograph we had. Howlett's, the wedding, party, the theatre group. He placed them into the fireplace one by one. Then he turned to me, his voice low but urgent. "She exists through our attention, through recognition. Each viewing gives her shape, identity, presence. We must sever her. Narrative." I nodded slowly. He struck a match and tossed it into the hearth. The flames roared to life. As the photographs curled and blackened, I felt an oppressive weight lift from the room. But just as I allowed myself to breathe again, there came a knock. At the door, 3 slow, deliberate raps. Holmes froze. I rose instinctively, but he held out a hand. "Don't open it." Another knock, then from under the door slid a photograph. Still damp. Holmes picked it up. It was the inside of our sitting room, the two of us, standing as we were now, and behind the window curtain, a shadow, long, feminine, watching. Chapter 8. The photograph lay between us like a piece of evidence dropped by fate itself. Holmes held it delicately by the corners, avoiding the still damp edges as though even the chemicals bore corruption. We stared down at our own likenesses, captured in perfect fidelity, and there, in the background, behind the curtain of our own sitting-room window, was a tall shadow, feminine, indistinct, but undeniably her. "She's inside," I whispered. "Holmes, she was inside." Holmes didn't speak. He walked to the curtain and flung it back. Nothing. Only the fog-choked street below. The gaslights flickered dully. No footprints on the sill. No broken pane. But we both knew this was no ordinary intruder. Holmes turned sharply and retrieved a sheet of white paper and a fountain pen. He scribbled furiously, muttering as he wrote. "She's escalating," he said. "This photograph was taken less than 20 minutes ago. That's not merely a message, Watson. It's a performance. She's showing us how close she can get." "To what end?" I asked. Holmes paused. "To be known, to be remembered. She is a narrative that refuses to die." He sealed the paper in an envelope and handed it to me. "Take this to Clara, immediately. Do not wait for a cab. Do not stop along the way. Give her these instructions and return before midnight." I glanced down at the envelope. What instructions? To blindfold her, to destroy all mirrors, and above all, she must not answer the door. The seriousness in his voice chilled me more than the words themselves. I obeyed at once. The streets of London had never felt so hostile. Even the rhythm of my own footsteps echoed with menace. Fog twisted through the alleyways, concealing corners and doorways. I passed a beggar on the curb who flinched at the sight of my face, then muttered a prayer under his breath. A newspaper blew past my feet. On its front page, a headline caught my eye. "Local woman found dead beside shattered mirror. Another death. Another pattern." But I had no time to investigate. Clara's safety, and perhaps our own, now hinged on Holmes's unspoken logic. I reached her lodging-house in Bloomsbury. She answered after the third knock, pale and drawn. "Watson!" I stepped inside and handed her the envelope. "Instructions. From Holmes. Follow them without question." She tore the seal and read quickly. Then she looked up, trembling. "He's right. I saw her, not in a photo. This time in the corner of my mirror, only for a second." But she looked disappointed, as if I wasn't ready yet. I helped her shatter the remaining mirrors and cover every reflective surface in the room with cloths. Then she sat, blindfolded, in her armchair, her hands clenched tightly. "Do you think this will stop her?" she asked quietly. "I think Holmes is gambling that her power lies in being seen," I replied. "And tonight no one must look." I returned to Baker Street shortly before midnight. The street was silent, but an unnatural stillness pressed in from all sides, like the city itself was holding its breath. Inside, I found Holmes exactly as I had left him, standing before the fireplace, the final photograph still smouldering to ash. He looked up as I entered. "She didn't follow you?" "No." "Then we have hours, perhaps, not more." I sat down slowly. You believe she's trying to anchor herself again? Holmes nodded. With each appearance, she grows more independent of the original images. She's not using photography anymore. She's using our perception of photography. She's become an idea, and ideas once born do not die easily. He walked to the desk and opened a drawer, retrieving a single item. A camera, but not his usual photographic equipment. This was old, Victorian era. Brass fittings, a cracked wooden casing, and a shattered lens. The original camera used by Aurelius Vance, Holmes said. Graft gave it to me before we left the cemetery. Said it was useless. I believe otherwise. He set it on the table with reverence. We must confront her, not in the dark, not through fear, but with truth. You intend to take her picture? I asked, incredulous. No, he said. I intend to let her take ours. The plan, if it could be called such, was madness. Holmes positioned the camera on the far end of the sitting room. The lens faced us. He placed 2 chairs, one for himself, one for me, before it. Why an old camera? I asked. Because this one is where it began. The aperture is cracked, the silver plate warped. If she appears in the viewfinder, it may be because she chooses to, or because she must. Either way, it's bait. And if she does, then we develop the final photograph. And whatever message she means to leave, we will answer it. We sat. The camera clicked, then silence. No movement, no shadow. But the air turned cold. Colder than any draught or winter breeze. Colder than death. I turned to Holmes. His eyes widened, not at me, but behind me. I followed his gaze. She stood just beyond the frame. Not in the room, but near it. Like an echo trying to become voice, the camera clicked again, and this time it shattered. Glass sprayed across the floor. The air sucked inward, and in that moment, between exposure and silence, I felt something move through me. Not past me, through me. I gasped, then it was gone. Holmes rushed to the camera. The plate had cracked clean down the center, but the image was still forming. We waited as the chemical bath revealed what the shattered lens had seen. It was us, sitting exactly as we had. But no figure stood behind us, no shadow, only a message, scratched into the bottom corner. Now you remember me. Holmes stared at the message. It's not a threat. No, I asked. He nodded slowly. It's a victory. I stood in stunned silence. Then we've lost? No, Holmes replied, his voice hollow. We've become the story now. And even as he said it, I knew it to be true. The moment I recount this tale, the moment you read it, you too will see her somewhere. In a mirror, in a reflection, in the grain of an old photograph. You will not recognize her at first, but she will be there. And when she is, she will smile. Chapter 9. The days that followed blurred together like smudged ink across the pages of memory. Time felt warped, fractured, not in the sense of minutes lost, but in the haunting feeling that we had stepped beyond its natural flow. I would awake with a start in the early hours, convinced I had seen her face in the grain of the wood, or lingering in the smoke from the fireplace. Each time I would rub my eyes, rise, and assure myself that I was mistaken. But I was never certain. Holmes kept himself occupied with rituals, sharpening his blades, disassembling and reassembling his revolver, drawing geometrical diagrams across the floor of our sitting room in chalk. He spoke little, ate less. He had crossed into a state of concentrated obsession I had only seen during his darkest investigations, and even then, it had never worn him down quite like this. "She's not, just an idea," he muttered one morning, pacing as I sat nursing a tepid cup of tea. "She's a narrative, and narratives once told spread like wildfire through the dry brush of the human mind." He tapped the mantel with his violin bow, the chalk dust still coating his hands. "She has no need for cameras anymore, Watson. She doesn't require film or silver nitrate or shutter speeds. She requires attention. The very act of remembering her, that is how she endures." "And what then?" I asked, finally exasperated. "Are we to say nothing? Write nothing? Erase every trace of this case and pretend it never happened?" Holmes turned to me with a slow, dreadful calm. "No, that would only delay her. You forget, silence is not the same as ignorance. She survives in anticipation, in imagination, in doubt." I stood. "Then what do we do?" Holmes's eyes met mine. We finished the story. That night Holmes requested we return to the Society of Photographic Science on Fleet Street. It was closed, naturally, but Holmes had long ago mastered the art of quiet intrusion. With a deft flick of his lockpick, we stepped once more into that hollow temple of frozen time, where images hung like spirits in glass coffins. This time we weren't alone. A man stood near the far cabinet, silhouetted against the stained glass of the upper windows, tall, dressed in a long charcoal coat, with his back turned to us. At first I assumed he was a night watchman, but something about the stillness, the utter lack of movement, unnerved me. Holmes froze beside me. "Sir?" I called out. The figure did not turn. Holmes stepped forward cautiously. "Watson, look at the wall." To the left of the figure, a new photograph hung among the others. It was already framed and mounted, but it had not been there on our last visit. The title plaque beneath it read, "The Final Exposure, Unknown Artist." The image was recent, perhaps days old. It showed a man, me, standing in the exact position I stood now. Behind me, a familiar room, the Society's reading chamber, and beside me, Holmes. We were looking at something just out of frame, and standing behind us, in the window's reflection, her. Holmes stepped beside the still figure, and gently turned the man by the shoulder. He collapsed at once, a corpse, eyes wide, mouth agape in the same silent scream we'd now seen more times than we cared to count. I crouched beside him. Who was he? Holmes checked the man's pockets, producing a small envelope. Inside was a folded letter written in slanted, elegant script. "To those who see her, I tried to warn them. I photographed her once. Thought I had captured something beautiful. I was wrong. I thought she wanted to be known. But she doesn't want to be known, Holmes. She wants to be retold. E.G. Emery Graft," Holmes muttered. He couldn't resist. He documented her return, immortalized it. And now he's part of the narrative too. My voice caught in my throat. "Then we're next." Holmes stood slowly, his face pale, eyes glittering with some terrible realization. Unless we end the story before she does. We returned to Baker Street with no plan, only urgency. Holmes locked every door and extinguished every lamp. The only light was from the hearth, now dim with orange coals. "Watson," he said, "do you trust me?" "Of course," he nodded. "Then I must ask you to do something that may sound mad." He opened his drawer and handed me a small vial filled with dark liquid. "Laudanum," I said. "You want me to sleep?" Not just sleep. Dream. Blood ran cold. "You believe she can enter dreams now?" "No. But I believe that within the dream you may see the narrative from the inside. You've witnessed her, been part of the arc. You are a carrier, Watson, perhaps even her narrator. If you can confront her there, if you can rewrite the conclusion, you may sever her thread." He handed me a pen and a fresh journal. "Write it down as soon as you wake, all of it, every detail, even if it doesn't make sense." "And if I don't wake up," Holmes looked away, "then I'll follow." I took the laudanum and lay on the settee. The fire pulsed softly. Holmes's silhouette faded from view as sleep overcame me. And then I was not in Baker Street anymore. I stood in a vast room made entirely of photographs. Walls, floor, ceiling, thousands of images pasted one over another. All of them. Of her. She was everywhere. Standing, sitting, smiling, frowning, young, old, blurred, sharp. Her eyes followed me from frame to frame. In the center of the room was a mirror, and in the mirror I saw myself holding a camera. She stood beside me, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. She whispered, "You won't forget me. None of them do, because you were always the one telling the story." The mirror cracked. I woke, gasping. Holmes was at my side, pressing the journal into my hands. "Write," he commanded, and I did. For hours, every image, every word, every impossible moment. When I finished, I placed the pen down. Holmes looked at me. "Well?" he asked. I opened the last page and read what I had not written. "Now they all remember me." Chapter 10. It has taken me weeks to write this final account, not because I lacked the words, but because each time I tried, I could feel her drawing near again, as if the ink were a beacon, as if my pen became the lens through which she watched. Holmes warned me, "She survives in the retelling, Watson." But something deeper compelled me to finish. Perhaps by giving her a conclusion, I might finally free her, and ourselves. That is what I tell myself, but I am not certain I believe it. After I woke from the laudanum-induced dream, the atmosphere in our flat was no longer one of dread. It was of finality. Holmes stood over the pages I had written, dozens of them. He read in silence. Occasionally he would nod, make a note, circle a phrase. He did not speak until he had finished the last word. "This," he said at last, tapping the final page, "is the key." "To what?" I asked hoarsely. "To her exit," Holmes replied. He stood and paced, his mind now ignited with the familiar spark I had come to trust. She exists as narrative structure. She does not live in time, but in the sequence of events. That is why she appears out of order, in photographs from different decades. That is why her face turns across images, not forward in time, but toward the end of a story. I felt a growing chill. So, she's looking for her ending. Holmes nodded. And you gave it to her, not by force, not with fire or silver, but with closure. He walked to the fireplace, removed all remaining pages from the various notes and journals he'd kept, and threw them in. Flames curled around them as he stood watching, quiet, sombre. We must not speak of her again, he said. Not to Lestrade, not to Clara, not even to each other. No final interviews, no scholarly papers, no memoirs. But this case, I said, it was unlike anything we've ever seen. Exactly, Holmes said, which is why it must remain unseen. And for a time, it did. The deaths stopped. No new photographs arrived at Baker Street. Clara, after several weeks, wrote to say that her dreams had returned to normal. She would resume her work, only not with photography, she added. She had taken a position in archival law. Holmes returned slowly to his violin, and then to his usual puzzles. Though he remained distant for a while, the light of reason returned to his eyes. He smiled more, smoked less. The fog lifted, and yet there were nights when I would find him standing by the window, looking not at the street, but at the reflection in the glass, watching, waiting, listening for a whisper that never came. It was as if a door had been closed, but we could still feel the draught. It was only months later, long after the case had gone cold and been buried in the private vaults of our minds, that the final incident occurred. Small package arrived at 221B Baker Street, unmarked, wrapped in brown paper. Inside, a single photograph. At first glance, it was a simple portrait. Me and Holmes, seated in the garden of the Diogenes Club. A photo neither of us recalled posing for. But something was wrong. In the background, nestled in the hedges, was a blur, a hint of a shape, the tilt of a chin, a sliver of dress fabric. She was almost hidden. Almost. Holmes examined the image with calm deliberation. Then he looked up at me. "Do you see her?" he asked softly. I hesitated, then nodded. He sighed. "Then she's still with us, fainter, distant, but not erased." I felt a tremor in my hand. "What do we do?" Holmes placed the photograph gently into an envelope, sealed it, and locked it away in the iron box beneath the floorboards, beside his revolver and a handful of other relics best forgotten. Then he lit the fire and played the violin. I never spoke of her again, not in print, not in memory, not even in dream. But now, as I write this final chapter, I know the danger I invite. You, reader, have walked with me. You have followed the breadcrumbs. You have seen her face, perhaps only in your imagination, but that is all she needs. A foothold, a flicker, a name, and now, perhaps, she is behind you too. But I will not describe her again. I will not give her another portrait, another angle, another chance. Instead, I end this story truly. Finally, because a story untold is a door unopened, and this door must remain shut. Farewell, Watson.